Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is Friday at 10:27. Hope everyone's doing good. It's a I guess pretty normal winter day. We had a pretty messy start to the day yesterday. I woke up to some pretty sad news with the passing of just a legend, one of my favorite actors of all time, Gene Hackman. So I did a little video on that yesterday, and was working on another video, and we had this like weird little power outage. Lost power for a couple of hours here, and it was snowing like crazy. And I thought work and things were going to get canceled. Stuff did get canceled, but work still was happening. But anyway, I finished that video. A special tribute to Gene Hackman. It's been up for a few minutes, so yeah, you know, just such a legend. Yeah, so very shocked with that. But anyway, moving forward, I'm in the midst of slowly getting finished with my coverage of of my favorite TV show of all time, True Detective Season 1. I've talked about that show quite a bit, and I've done a few videos on that show. You can never things that you love and things that you really appreciate and that inspire you. I think you I don't know. I think you can never talk about them enough. So that show or that series, this newer series that I'm doing is a little bit different because I'm talking about each individual episode. So I'm slowly getting that done, and in the meantime, I'm doing these other videos, like that I normally do with movie reviews and such. So, and again, I want to thank all of the awesome folks that continue to support this wacky thing I do. I really, really appreciate it. I really love it. I love the conversations we get to have back and forth about movies that we both love, and also sharing ideas, sharing movies that I have never seen before, and vice versa. It's all about that. So today's show is on a movie that is. I watched this again last night, and I've seen it so many freaking times. I literally have lost count. It's one of those movies. It's one of those situations that I've described that happens a lot for me when I rewatch a movie, or just because I fall in love with it, and I have a long history with it. And I have done a couple of shows on this movie, but I had not watched this movie in a very long time, and I just think I never hear this movie ever talked about. It's so crazy, I think, and so surprising. Even in the world of YouTube, where there's a lot of great YouTube guys talking about all kinds of things, especially when it's pertaining to the world of exploitation. This is one movie I never hear people talk about, which I'm always like, wow, like this is one of the best. And that is The Car. This movie I just think is such a badass exploitation movie. I watched this again last night. 1977. I mean, you can't get any better than that. Amazing cast. Ronnie Cox, Kathleen Lloyd, Hank Hamilton, Kim Richards, Kyle Richards, John John Marley, which I always forget that he's in this, and he was a really great character actor. He did this movie, kind of somewhat towards the end of his career. John Marley, of course, was in the my favorite movie of all time, and he's in probably one of the most infamous scenes ever in film history, and that is The Godfather, the horsehead scene. He plays the kind of the Hollywood mogul guy who is given, who is really kind of trying to strong arm the, Michael Corleone and the Corleone family of trying to help them get one of their favorite, singers and somebody who is also an actor. He's trying to get them a recording contract or trying to get him into acting. but his character is refusing, so they make him an offer he can't refuse. I mean, one of the most infamous scenes, still holds up, but I always forget that John Marley is in this film. John Rubenstein, just I just love this movie so much. Also, we can't forget James Brolin. He's the star of this movie. It's funny watching James Brolin in this film because he's really young. He's kind of a young stud in this movie, 1977. James Brolin, I feel like Josh Brolin is so his son, who is such an awesome actor, but he I just feel like when I see Josh Brolin in films now, it's like he's like the twin version of his dad, especially when Josh was a few years younger. Yeah, I mean, just the physicality, everything. It's amazing. But so great. Um, James Brolin was, back in the day in the 70s, he was a highly prolific actor, of course. I remember watching when I was a kid, and it was kind of a terrible soap opera show, but he was very, very, he was a big star. It was a little bit later in his career after his film career had really taken off. He was in a TV show that was called, I think it was called Hotel, and it was on ABC, and this is going back in like the 80s. I remember it being a kind of a terrible, cheesy show, like kind of definitely like a soap opera kind of a thing. But he did that a little bit later in his career after he was really established. But 77 in the early 70s, mid 70s, he was, kind of a Hollywood rock star. And I love this fucking movie so much. It's so funny. I have not watched this movie in quite a few years. Well, actually, not quite a few years, but it's probably been a year or two since I've watched this, and I have seen this movie like a billion times. I never get sick of it. I actually enjoy it more and more. The thing that really stood out to me last night, and again, it's been a while since I've seen this movie. It's just like how utterly this movie is such. Well, it fits in the very. It's the very definition of exploitation. It's such a ripoff of Jaws. It's hilarious. And Jaws, of course, an iconic movie directed by Steven Spielberg, arguably his best movie, and which I consider to be a horror classic. I love that movie to death. But that movie was directed by Steven Spielberg, but that movie was a phenomenon when it came out. I mean, it's inspired so many movies. Another film that Jaws really, really inspired a lot, which is my favorite slasher movie of all time, Maniac, directed by Bill Luswig. That movie was so inspired, especially the beginning of that movie. If you watch it, it's pretty funny, like how influential Jaws was, and how you had these low budget studios or these knockoff exploitation directors were seeing you know were really bearing witness and focusing on how massively commercially successful Jaws was, and they were like, okay, we gotta figure out a way to like do the same thing, but with barely any money or half the money that Steven Spielberg had. And as a result, you have this kind of wonderful piece of trash. This movie is, there's scenes and acting in this movie that, and some of the writing where it's kind of cringeworthy and just kind of fucking awful. But again, it's one of those things, and I firmly believe in the saying, "It's so bad, it's good." I think that's so true. And I often think like, what makes that? What makes that a thing? Like, why is that? When you watch certain films where they might just be bad, and that's it. And there's no like redeeming quality about it, or it's you know there's nothing, I don't know, funny or whimsical about it. I think of a movie like the Wolfman, Lee Winnell's newest latest film. It was the first movie I saw in the theater this year, 2025, and that movie was one of the biggest disappointments. And that movie's a pretty bad movie, where I feel like it's to me it's like when I don't know, it's like when I compare the two, like at face value, and at when it comes to pure cinema, The Car is a terrible movie, right? And then also I feel with Lee Winnell's Wolfman, which I've done a review on, and I've talked about that movie quite a bit. At face value, I think it's a terrible movie. But that movie I feel is kind of so bad it's just bad. Like doesn't have any qualities to it that are, it's not really, it takes itself so seriously, and it doesn't have a fun aspect to it. It's not like really enjoyable. It's tedious, it's kind of boring. It's it doesn't really go anywhere. There was this kind of relatively big campaign for that movie with trailers and all of the media outlets talking about this film and all of the interviews that Lee Winnell was giving. There was a lot of build up around that film, but it doesn't really have any redeeming qualities. Like it's just not really fun. It's not really even, I don't really even consider it a werewolf movie. So, but like you take, so it's interesting because you take a movie like this, 1977, which for all intents and purposes is a total piece of trash, but this movie is fun as fuck. It's got, and again, it's so obvious that it's a ripoff of Jaws, and the special features on here, they talk about that. Director Elliot Silverstein talks extensively about that, and it's really interesting. But at the same time, I think The Car is its own movie. You know, the it's it's actually a pretty, suspenseful movie. It's actually scary. I remember seeing this movie all the all the time when I was a kid. It would be on cable, and I remember getting it on VHS. I used to watch the shit out of this movie all the time as a kid. And this movie like scared this movie gave me nightmares. There's the one sequence where the car drives through the house and kills Josh Brolin's love interest, his girlfriend, who is kind of this like super annoying character, and you kind of want to see her get killed. But that scene in particular just terrified me as a kid and gave me nightmares. And I think it still holds up. Like there's some really ominous and scary, moments. It's very intense. But again, it's from a technical standpoint, the dialogue and some of the acting is just atrocious. There's all this terrible shit in it, but it's so fucking fun and I love it. And the thing that's so funny about this movie is, you know, the studio that put this film out was Universal Pictures. They clearly, like in the special features, Universal Pictures went to Elliot Silverstein, the director, and were like, okay, Jaws had just come out. We want to capitalize on it, but we're gonna we're gonna rip this movie off and make a shit ton of money, just like Jaws. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna give you like less than half the budget, so it's gonna look like shit. And that's kind of like how he describes this movie, and it's hilarious. But because it's so low budget, it gives it so much charm. And that being said, it it's actually a very funny movie. It's got some unbelievably amazing car chase scenes. The design of the car is super badass. The kills are kind of amazing. the opening sequence for this film with the two bike riders, where they both get run over and annihilated, are just so awesome and so iconic. And and the other thing too that stood out to me last night watching this movie, I consider this movie a total slasher movie. And the only difference is the slasher or the killer is this car, but it's totally a slasher movie, like 100%. And it's funny, I never really thought of that before, and I've seen this movie a billion times. And I looked at this movie, I'd always thought of this movie as just being, a real amazingly cheesy but super fun, horror movie. But now after watching this last night, those two things really stood out. Like how how much it really does rip off Jaws. Like, obviously, it was always a thing, and I was always, you know, I always noticed that, and it's pretty obvious. But last night, I noticed it even more, with to a point of where it's almost shot for shot of that's taken from the Steven Spielberg film. It's kind of insane. But again, it's different. It's kind of Jaws on land, but it does its own thing. It does it. I think this movie it is a total ripoff, obviously, of something else, but it definitely has its own identity as a movie. I think it stands on its own. It's and again, the thing that's so funny about this movie is they had no budget, but they with the incredible restraints that they had, they do some amazing things with it. And again, I when I bought this movie, I bought this about 4 years ago on Blu-ray. When I came across this, and again, it was like 4 years ago or so. I bought this. When I came across this at Bull Moose, I think it was before COVID, so it was probably like 5 years ago. When I came across this at Bull Moose, and I think I bought it at the Bull Moose in Bangor, I kind of pooped myself. I couldn't believe it. I was just like, "What the fuck?" Because this movie was, this was definitely one of the main kind of horror exploitation movies that I used to watch all the time as a kid. This movie was always on cable back in the day when it was just straight up cable in the 80s, and they used to have these horror marathons, and this would always be on cable. And then I used to get this all the time on VHS. It was like a part of my youth, this movie. And I've as much as I love Jaws, and it's an iconic film, and I love that movie. I don't own it on Blu-ray, which I do need to eventually get. I have actually seen this more than Jaws, like by many, by a much huge, enormous times of numbers, just like 100 to 1 billion. I know it sounds kind of ridiculous, but that's kind of how my brain works. And so part of it is seeing it. When I saw it at the shop that time when I bought it, I was just like, I couldn't believe it, because suddenly it was like, I mean, it was all out of pure nostalgia, because my as a kid, this I was tied so much to this movie. And other movies that I remember, like, that I now own on Blu-ray, like this classic here. Other movies that were definitely like the part of that horror exploitation movies that I used to watch all the time were like, I mean, of course, Friday 13th movies, John Carpenter's Halloween, but then also Tourist Trap, which is my favorite horror exploitation movie of all time. I have multiple shows on that. That movie was a regular thing I used to always see. The Ghoulies was another one, and I have that on Blu-ray. The Car was always in constant rotation. The House by the Cemetery. There was a whole bunch of like super low budget movies that were things I always watched. And this was one of them. I mean, one of the biggest. So it was kind of like stepping into a dream when I saw this. And again, I have to say that this is, and I own quite a few movies now, quite a few Blu-rays, and I have to say this is one of the most gorgeous looking Blu-rays I have ever seen. The cinematography for this film is like, it's so amazing because the whole film takes place in this kind of desert environment, and it's all mountainous, but it's gorgeous. I mean, beautiful. It's interesting to me because this movie is, it's a pure horror movie, and it's super cheesy, but the cinematography in this movie is just astoundingly beautiful. That it's like high art. I think the cinematography and the locations that they use for this film really elevated this movie because because they had no budget. So you have all of these long panning shots of the car. I mean, especially the opening sequence for this movie is so awesome because you get this giant panning scene of this desert vista, and way off in the distance you start seeing these little you start seeing this scene of the dust slowly being kicked up, and it's the car, and there's like these long kind of takes, and the car comes into focus, and it's super ominous and super badass. And I just love this fucking movie. It's one of my. I did a top. I think I did a top 20 list last year for my favorite horror exploitation movies, and this movie is definitely on there. It's a masterpiece. This Blu-ray edition is incredible. It's like seeing it for the first time. I highly recommend it to anyone. And if you can get this version of it, it's the definitive version of this super cheeseball classic. Love this shit to death. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.